Hello, I'm Sumit Bose, founder of Future Net Zero. We are a website that produces content to help you cut your carbon footprint. And the nethero podcast is all about that, highlighting people doing amazing things to cut emissions, be that scientists, business people, inventors, or just common, ordinary people who are doing something to make a change. If you want to get involved, then email us. And we're looking for a sponsor for this amazing podcast. So if you'd like to know more, get in touch. On to this week's episode. Get rid of planes. They're evil. Stop tourism. Now look, that's a view that's out there. And it's a view that I think is completely stupid. You can't take back technology. But there's no doubt that flying around the world is causing a problem to our planet. For years, we've been looking at this in various ways, and there is a school of thought which is tourism is bad, that we should all cut down on our flights, and there is probably some merit in that in some cases. But the reality is we fly for pleasure, we also fly for business. Flying creates jobs, and it creates industries around the world. We ship goods, what would we do without them? So the best way to try and deal with this, in my view, and what most governments around the world have decided, is to try and make flying more sustainable. Now, the global footprint of flying is about they say between 2 to 5% of all emissions. So it doesn't sound like massive amounts, but it is pretty big. And also, they're chucking loads of crap into the atmosphere. For a while, people have looked at how we make this better. Some have talked about new planes, battery-operated planes, or, fully electric ones, or planes that are much more aerodynamic. But the reality is, at present, we don't have that full technology, so we still have to use fuel. And you may have heard of a term called SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel. Is that really the way to go? Well, that's one of the things we're going to talk about today on the nethero podcast. And I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Jonathan Wood, from a company called Nova Pangea Technologies, which is it's a British company looking at trying to make our flying cleaner and greener. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining me.
Happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Now let's do some disclosures. You used to work for BP, right? So you've been in that energy, the oil industry for a while. I know you've left. I'm not someone who's negative to what oil and gas is. It's built our world, for God's sakes. But the problem is the footprint has been very destructive. Why do you think the world of aviation fuel has to change? Because some would say, let's not bother. As I said in the little intro there, let's just go and electrify. But I can see a lot of problems with that, and I know there's a lot of science that says it. Do you see fuel being the key to us getting cleaner aviation?
In a nutshell, yes, you're absolutely right that there are various opportunities here to develop new propulsion systems, electric and even hydrogen. Electric looks like it might be feasible for shorter haul and smaller aircraft, but for the larger and long haul aircraft, we need a liquid hydrocarbon fuel. So the challenge is to find a way of making that possible, but in so doing, not adding to the carbon that's in our ecosystem, not digging more out of the ground, but rather recycling that's already in our ecosystem. There's no free lunch at the end of the day. This is the technology development and the development of the supply chains and production of this fuel, at least in the near term, looks like it's going to be higher cost than the fossil jet fuel that we've been using up until now. But we've got to move in this direction, and there are various options, and we need to be pushing hard on all of these options. And ultimately, the market and technology development will determine which come to the fore and which are the solutions that really can be scaled up.
Why have you joined a startup? Because obviously, you've had a big corporate career, and why in this particular field?
Well, certainly in this field, I've been in the energy and the fuels business all my career. I certainly started to see more than 10 years ago the need for lower carbon fuels. I think now, meanwhile, the science for all of us in society is compelling that we need to do this. So it was a business opportunity as well as also, quite frankly, something that is energizing to do, to be doing something that everybody needs energy and fuel. So to find a way and to help build the industry to a more sustainable in a more sustainable way is something that's, it's also energizing and I enjoy doing. Um, so that's why I'm here. But moving from a larger corporate, well, to now a smaller startup, I mean that's just to a degree a bit of luck as to how my career has developed. But I certainly have felt uh, when I moved 5 years ago from BP to Neste, that was a conscious choice to try and bring my skills and experience to bear in the renewable fuel sector. And quite frankly, my recent move, I really thought that I could help with my experience a smaller company. And quite frankly, a lot of the technology development right now is taking place in those smaller companies. So
And that's the
it's far
point.
from an
Yeah.
easy ride.
It's bizarre, isn't it? Because the jet fuel industry has been around for 90 years, 80 years, whatever it is, right? And massive companies, we won't name them, but we all know they are. They make jet fuel. So it's kind of weird that you've moved to a small one looking at this system, because you'd think the big ones, and I know the big ones are working on this, but that would be the place where all the science and the innovation's happening.
Well, it's happening in both places, but often these new technology developments and it's not just in the oil or the energy business, but it's also in pharmaceuticals and otherwise. It often actually happens in smaller companies.
Yeah.
And if in due course they partner up or even get acquired by the large companies, at the end of the day, that's not a problem, so long as it enables the scale up and the investment that's required. So, as we look to grow Nova Pangea Technologies, we'll be looking to raise finance, and we'll be looking to larger partners to help. And they could be venture capital companies, they could be private equity, but it could also be energy companies. And that's okay, because we'll be wanting to partner with them to roll out this technology, to build the production facilities and operate them.
Let's do a little bit more about the fuel picture, and then we'll talk about the technology you guys are doing. So, from my research, about 90% of aviation's actual footprint is the fuel. In general terms, and you said you've worked in fuels all your life, where does it always has it always come from? Is it the same fuel that we would stick in our cars? Is it like a type of unleaded petrol or diesel, or is it completely different, the fuel that goes in a jumbo jet?
Well, fundamentally, it's coming from the same production facilities or refineries today. It's being dug out of the ground, brought to these major refineries, and basically it's a distillation column where you boil and distill the oil, and you get different fractions or different cuts. And so it's very similar to diesel, slightly different to motor spirit or gasoline, but it's coming from the same facilities. Obviously, jet fuel in particular has to be very carefully managed from a product quality point of view, because obviously we can't afford any quality issues in an aircraft. Once it's up in the air, that's it. There's no parking lots in the sky. So
Yes.
so uh, so the quality control, especially around jet fuel, is super tight, and the same obviously must apply to sustainable aviation fuel. So yeah, we can use the same supply chain facilities, tanks, pipes, vessels, all the way to the airport. And that's the great thing about sustainable aviation fuel made from renewable raw materials, is that it meets certain specs. That means
There's
that
no
it
new
can be deployed
infrastructure.
through
Yeah.
exactly the same
Yeah.
infrastructure to the same aircraft. So the switching costs. I mean, the energy transition is going to cost us trillions. Even in the aviation sector, the provision of SAF is going to cost us billions. But it costs us a damn sight lot more if we had to change all the infrastructure and the aircraft engines as well.
The fuel that goes into planes is, they always say it's jet fuel, whatever. It is super pure, isn't it? Because the way that jet engines work and everything like that. So is that a very important part when you're developing your SAFs, your sustainable fuel, to make it that kind of level of purity, or that level of kind of cleanliness that's needed for this particular sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And so all aviation fuels have to go through an approval process by an international body called ASTM. But that's where the aircraft manufacturers and engine manufacturers sit together, and any fuel or any production process or raw material and the production process it's used in has to be approved so that it is then can be deployed. It's not like it's down to each and every aircraft manufacturer or even airline to choose. It has to all be approved scientifically and rigorously over many years. And that's one of the challenges of obviously bringing new sustainable aviation fuels to market is you need to first develop it, you need to get it approved, then you need to obviously invest in the production facilities and scaling it up. So you're looking at a 10-year project, to be frank, from
Yeah.
start to finish on this.
Is it the same fuel used around the world? So everyone uses like you go to a petrol station, you get E10, you can get E7, whatever. Is it the same grade used in every plane around the world?
Yeah, basically, chemically, and in terms of its specification, it's the same. Once it's going into the aircraft, it's the same. Yeah.
So let's talk about what you're doing. So you're using plant material. Where does it come from? What are you doing with it? And what do you make at the end of it?
Yeah, so Nova Pangaea Technologies is basically got a process whereby we take waste biomass, and that can be forestry residue, wood chips, sawdust, but also agricultural residue. So it could be the leftovers from wheat straw, the leftover wheat production, or it could be corn stover, or it could be even bagasse, which is the leftovers from sugar cane production. So it's basically taking waste biomass
Yeah.
and then basically putting it through a process, cleaning it, and then putting it through a process whereby we produce at the end of it sugars, which then are fermented into an alcohol called ethanol, which then is upgraded to make a fuel. And we also have a co-product, and this is the aspect of our process which is particularly interesting. So for any 10 tons of raw material biomass waste we may put in, we might get 5 tons of ethanol out and 5 tons of a solid product called lignin, which is basically carbon that's been captured and sequestered in a solid material, and it doesn't decompose. And that can be deployed in the farming sector or in horticulture or even in the construction and cement sector. And so you're effectively locking away the carbon in the ecosystem. And that means that the ethanol that we're making and the sustainable aviation fuel that's made from that ethanol can even be carbon negative, if I can put it like that. So not only are we not digging and adding to the carbon ecosystem, we're actually producing a fuel and so doing capturing some carbon that was previously in the ecosystem. So
No, yeah, it's great stuff.
so it's at the very least carbon neutral and potentially carbon negative, depending on how you make it. Whether you use renewable power and the like in the production process.
The government previous government set up something called Jet Zero, which was a council to look at getting us to greener fuels. I'm assuming Labour will do the same. But at present, we were talking before we started recording, the fuel you produce, the ethanol type fuel, 2 quick questions. Could it go into a plane? And also, you told me it doesn't go into a plane right now. So explain why it doesn't go into a plane, even though it could.
The ethanol that we make has to be then upgraded into a jet fuel, meeting the jet fuel specs. And then right now, aircraft on the aviation industry requires it to be mixed with fossil jet fuel. But in due course, it's expected that all aircraft will be able to take 100% sustainable aviation fuel. So that's the first thing. The ethanol is an intermediate step to the final fuel. Where are we at as Nova Pangaea Technologies? Well, we've got a demonstration plant. We've been running. We're testing various raw materials and the setup so we can build our first plant in the UK. We've got a plan for 4 plants in the UK and then to deploy it with partners elsewhere in the world. But we need to raise the money for that. These manufacturing facilities don't come cheap. So we'll be looking at more or less 100 million for the first plant and more for the second, third, and fourth. So for a small company like Nova Pangaea Technologies, raising the finance and bringing in partners is absolutely critical to the scale up that we want to achieve as an industry.
The fuel you talked about, and I assume this is the same around the world. So even if you're making SAF right now, it still gets blended with fossil fuels. And is that a safety issue that the aviation industry forces on fuel manufacturers then?
Um, yes, in essence, because so far, even though aircraft being made today that can take 100% pure sustainable aviation fuel, it's not been approved yet for use at 100% level. And that's because we've got older aircraft with
Yeah, of
systems that
course.
don't yet accommodate the, I'll say, higher quality, if I can put it like that, fuel. Because you, ironically, with sustainable aviation fuel, you don't actually have some of the impurities and particulates that you have with fossil jet fuel. So, ironically, because it's so clean, one or two of the aspects of the systems in aircraft have difficulty accommodating it, which is why, therefore, it has to be blended today at up to a maximum of 50% with fossil jet fuel.
But that will probably change as we get newer planes on board, yeah?
Exactly. And
It,
everybody in the industry is
yeah.
aligned about that. And you've already seen test flights using 100% SAF.
People talk about the emissions, and when I was a kid, I used to love watching planes. Still do actually, seeing planes go through the sky, and there's a little cloud behind them, and all of that. With this SAF, and I don't know if you know the answer to this or the science has been done. What does it chuck out the back end? So obviously the stuff is coming from green biomass to begin with, and you're trying to reduce its footprint. But at the end, it's something's got to come out that jet engine that's flying my plane. What comes out of it?
Right. So a couple of aspects to this. So when the fuel is put in the engine, it is combusted and it does still, whether it's sustainable aviation fuel or fuel made from fossil oil dug out of the ground, it's still emitting, having got emissions, including carbon dioxide. The
Of course.
beauty of sustainable aviation fuel is that it basically is a circular recycling system where ultimately we're taking biomass that's consuming that carbon dioxide and we're recycling it. As to your point about these white contrails or stripes that you
Yeah.
see at the back of aircraft, that's a new area that science is looking at right now. But basically, the fuel creates, when being emitted at very cold temperatures, especially at the higher altitudes, 30,000 feet and higher, it crystallizes, it creates droplets, and these effectively clouds, which actually also contribute to global warming. And it varies very much according to the temperature and the altitude and the weather conditions. But you can have some flights where there's no such contrail stripes at the back of the aircraft, and others where there are. And those actually are an additional issue which is contributing to global warming, which goes beyond the CO2 emissions.
Ah.
So when we talk about aviation contributing maybe 2 to 3% of global carbon dioxide emissions, actually the issue is goes beyond that because you could potentially double the impact, the negative impact on global warming as a result of these so-called contrails at the back of the aircraft. Now,
And is it?
the good news is that when you use sustainable aviation fuel, it can also help mitigate these contrails because there are fewer
Ah.
particulates. It doesn't form as many crystals, and therefore you don't get this condensation and the cloud formation. But there are other tools as well, and the industry is working on this as well. Route planning, but also very agile, flexible route planning to try and avoid weather conditions that are particularly conducive to the formation of these contrails. And other tools and techniques. So this is another issue that the industry needs to work on. And ironically, all of these issues, are not these so-called externality issues, these environmental impacts. They're not in the ticket price. Nobody is charging you for them.
No.
You need to somehow address them because, and when we all complain about the price of our ticket, you know, we're not actually paying the full price because all of these negative knock-on effects that aren't being adequately priced in the market. And that's why regulatory policy, like we've seen in the UK and the EU and elsewhere, is really, really critical because ultimately we need to be recognizing the costs and dealing with them. And if that means we have to actually pay a bit more on the ticket price, well, so be it. Because guess what? You'll hear airlines talk about their wafer thin margins and the fact that that they can't afford from a competitive point of view to voluntarily, double their fuel cost. But on the other side of the coin, if you put it in terms of what it means on the ticket price, it may be only the price of a coffee and a croissant at the airport. So
Yeah,
let's put
yeah.
these things in relation to one another. I mean, the airlines clearly can't simply eat the cost. It ultimately has to be passed on. The polluter pays principle applies here as well. But I would argue that, we can find ways of doing this, which doesn't make aviation unaffordable for all users.
And that's an important thing. What did you say they were called? Contrails.
Contrails, yeah.
Wow, look at that. I've learnt a brilliant new word. That's worth the podcast itself. And they are basically little clouds, aren't they? That's
Yeah.
what I was always told. Um, I think that, before we end, there is the debate which is there. And I said at the beginning, I think we have to continue flying. I think flying is vital. I think it opens people's minds. It creates jobs. It creates a big kind of, helps a lot of people around the world. One of the things that would be always thrown is that, there is an imbalance, and there is everywhere, and between the global north and global south in terms of what they're using and how they're doing it. Do you think that, you're talking across the board? I assume you've spent, like you said, many years in the fuel industry. Is there an awareness that as we do this transition, two things, we have to make flights still affordable for everyone, and B, that, as you said earlier, the polluter must pay. There should be more sanctions on people where they're flying more in richer countries than places in sub-Saharan Africa where there's one flight maybe every 2 weeks.
Well, I think the more you fly, the more you'll pay, and also, so I'm a firm believer that regulatory policy needs to and absolutely must and can help us move along this transition to using sustainable aviation fuels. But there's also this so-called voluntary market. So, many companies are now making it possible for those who can afford, who have more disposable income, to voluntarily choose to fully decarbonize their flight. So even if
Yeah.
so you can book flights and voluntarily
No, there's
choose
the button. Yeah, tick the CO2. Yeah, yeah.
do you want to buy SAF, to have SAF on your flight, and you can even have this option to go from 0 to 100%. So guess what? When you when you make a booking, you can actually choose to, at least for the trip you're paying for, to make a contribution voluntarily
Wow.
over and above whatever may be mandated and required by all suppliers and airlines to use. And that goes all the way through to business aviation, private jets, and so on. I've worked with companies where they are actively promoting and making it the very heart of their offer to richer, wealthier individuals to say, right, we're going to, our default is that half of the fuel is going to be, or a third of the fuel is going to be sustainable aviation fuel. And that's going to cost you an extra sum of money. And on a private jet, that might not be a few pounds, it might be a few £100, but they're willing to do it. And it is actually happening. And these early adopters who have the disposable income absolutely need to be the first to move. Likewise, in the aviation world, you've got companies, corporations who have their own net zero targets, who've got business travel, but also other operations, and they're actively buying the carbon emission reduction that's associated to help promote the production and use of sustainable aviation fuel, or the co-products like the biochar I mentioned earlier, the Microsofts and the Googles of this world, and also companies that have supply chains with air cargo and the like, the Patagonias of this world, who clearly have a stance on ESG and environmentally friendly products and supply chains, and they're seeing it. There's a value. It's part of their value proposition. So there are a number of ways by which we can help drive this, and are driving this already in advance of any mandate policy. And that's the way that I think you can see putting bluntly, the richer sections of society, whether it's in the north or whether it's within the north, particular segments of society can already help pull this along.
Final question. Do you think we'll ever get to kind of zero carbon flying?
I think we'll. I mean, the issue is aircraft have
ignoring their
30
footprint.
years.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we can act.
But running the actual thing without any emissions. Do you think we'll ever get there?
We can definitely get there with sustainable aviation fuel and other associated activities. We can definitely get to a place where the aviation can be net zero, and that's what the industry is committed to by 2050. But it's very easy to make a long-term a goal that you're not going to be around to deliver on. So that's where I think, like in all industries, it's absolutely essential that we be setting targets for 2030, 2035, 2040. And that's what, the policies are now starting to set targets around. And it's not going to be easy. But it's the same in aviation as it is in the passenger car market and the like. We've got to set these targets, otherwise we're not going to get to the end goal. And by the way, we haven't got any time to waste on this because we can see what's happening all around us.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. It's been great. It's been excellent. It's I've flown with you now. I feel good.
You're on board.
I feel lighter.
I'm
on board, Jonathan. I've just got to learn to do the exits are over there, so we'll do that. Brilliant stuff. Thank you very much. Good luck with everything you're doing at Nova Pangea. Great name. I love it. Thank you for joining us on the nethero podcast.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot, Sumit.
If you have a thought about flying and sustainable flying, then let us know on social media. If you have a story to tell, get in touch. nethero@futurenetzero.com. I'll see you on the next episode.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from futurenetzero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.